everybody. I am not Jason Pack. I am Alex Hall.
And I'm not Jason Pack either. I'm Jane Kinninmont, and this is Disorder, a podcast where we try to find order in our mad world.
Oh, I like the way you say that, Jane. This is a very special podcast. It's the first one that Jane and I have done together without our beloved leader, Jason Pack. He has trusted Jane and me to do this by ourselves.
Or Jason perhaps has been usurped by two women. Let's see if we see him again in future.
Yeah, feedback please. Let's see how listeners react to this one. But the real reason we're here, and to introduce a serious note, and much more importantly, we are pulling this episode together at very short notice to talk about the ceasefire deal that's been reached, which we both desperately hope holds and desperately hope offers some relief for the traumatized populations of Israel and Gaza. And just before we get into the substance of this episode, I have to say that some of you who've been following me on social media will know that I have a very good friend in Gaza called Nabil, who I have been trying to sustain through this conflict. The good news is that he and his family are still alive. I was in touch with him last night, and he said, "We lived through it. But the scars on our souls are very, very deep, and he doesn't know what he's going to do next." And he also said, there are still killings and bombs happening around us. And some of you may have seen that in the last 24 hours, Israel has still continued to attack Gaza, resulting in the deaths of women and children. So this is a very tenuous, fragile deal. Okay, so that's enough from me to set the scene. I'm going to ask Jane to help orientate this discussion. Jane, can you sketch out for us in summary what are the main elements of the deal?
So this agreement is structured into 3 phases, with the idea being that a ceasefire is the first step and that this must lead to a pathway to a negotiated, lasting end to the war. But that's very difficult because nobody knows what that will look like. So the idea has been to design an initial phase in quite a lot of detail that should then create some space and some trust, if things go well, to move on to harder decisions in subsequent phases. So the first thing that is meant to come into effect on Sunday, if it all goes through, is an initial ceasefire of 6 weeks. And during that period, Hamas will release 33 of the hostages that it seized in the attack of 7th October 2023. It's not clear how many of those 33 are still alive. And one of the things that these negotiators have to deal with is literally trading and haggling over human remains and returning bodies to their families. In return for each hostage set free, Israel will release dozens of Palestinian prisoners. So again, loads of time has been spent in prioritising who gets to be let out when. Israel will pull its soldiers out of the more densely populated parts of Gaza into a so-called buffer zone on the eastern side, so Israeli troops will remain inside Gaza, but more along the borders. And one of the most crucial things is to immediately allow in more aid, including fuel, because clearly, as everybody knows, this is one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, so getting food, getting medicines, all these desperately needed things can be one of the things that builds confidence that this ceasefire is making a difference. And there will be a managed return of the majority of the population who are displaced to their homes, if their homes are still standing, because we've seen all the images of so much of Gaza being reduced to rubble. This phase still leaves a group of Israeli hostages, mostly men of military age, who will remain in captivity. Their fate has been left up to another round of talks, which are due to start 16 days into the ceasefire. Essentially, the logic of this is to keep things going so that there isn't a situation where hostages and prisoners are released and then everything stops. But it means, of course, continued agony for their family, wondering whether things will be sustained. Because that is the hard part. All these things that we're discussing now are the relatively easy bits. The next questions are really about who will run Gaza, what will Israel's role be, what kind of life can Palestinians have there, all of the issues that actually predate October 7th. One smart element of the design that President Biden mentioned yesterday is that the ceasefire is supposed to stay in place until the parties reach an agreement on the next phase. So if there's a long impasse or if they simply stop talking to one another, that should not be an excuse for returning to fighting. But that's the theory, and in practice it's often very difficult to manage the implementation of a ceasefire.
In summary, it seems like what you're saying is that the deal treats the immediate symptoms, the conflict, the live conflict, but not the underlying causes behind it. And that remains on the table as knotty issues that have eluded previous governments and previous US presidencies for decades. And I think we should come back to that. What is the hope of this ceasefire, if the ceasefire itself holds, actually trying to unlock progress on a more sustainable Israeli-Palestinian agreement, on which I have to say I remain somewhat skeptical. And in your very first introduction, you said that the aim of this deal is that each phase is supposed to establish trust and open the way for progress on the next stage, where each issue gets successively harder, like releasing the younger hostages, the female hostages, the older hostages, but holding back the men of military age. And for the Israelis deciding which prisoners to release. And the price for each exchange may get harder and more difficult to sell politically on each side. So that lack of trust that exists at the moment, will they be able to establish that in an astonishingly short period of time? Because I've been thinking about the Northern Ireland peace process, and that required years of behind-the-scenes talks and efforts to build up trust, and huge efforts by international partners and the parameters of the EU to create the context in which the immediate warring parties could decide to let go of some of their red lines. So this is very fragile and very complex. But just on the immediate context of reaching this deal at all, why now? What was it that allowed for this breakthrough to finally happen? When, as President Biden made clear in his press conference announcing the deal, the essential parameters are the same as what was on the table back in May. Why wasn't it possible to do the deal then? In the intervening months, thousands more people have died. Tragically, more hostages have lost their lives. I mean, what was it that enabled the deal to come together now?
The timing really is down to Trump, in my opinion, having followed this closely, the on again, off again, all of the statements we've heard for months saying we're nearly there, we're 90% of the way there. The Biden administration has not been able to implement the plan that they have painstakingly designed. And, some of that is to do with timing. Over time, Israel has become more convinced that it has done pretty much as it can do militarily. And Hamas has also seen its leadership decimated and has obviously lost, in particular, the mastermind of October 7th, Yahya Sinwar, who was widely seen as one of the main obstacles to a deal. But, back in November, the Israeli media was reporting that Yoav Gallant, the outgoing defence minister, sacked by Netanyahu despite his military successes from Israel's point of view, he was reported as having said to hostages' families, the IDF has now achieved its aims. That was in November. And, the common interpretation in the Israeli media is that this continuing war has had a lot more to do with Netanyahu and the politics of his coalition than with what the military think they can still do in Gaza. And essentially, Netanyahu is expecting to have a very good relationship with Trump, but not a relationship where he gets to call all the shots. He seems to have been incredibly effective at essentially playing the Biden administration. And it doesn't seem that Trump is going to have the same approach. It seems that Trump's envoy has gone and knocked heads together and said, tough luck, time is up. We want a bit of good news before the inauguration. At the end of the day, Trump is not going to make peace in Ukraine on day one. And compared to that, this is a relatively low-hanging fruit. The work has been done. He's just pushed it across the line. He has taken credit for that, of course, but he probably deserves that credit.
But what was it that Trump did? Why was he able to apply enough pressure on Netanyahu, and why was Biden unable to?
It looks like Trump has used both carrots and sticks, really, that Netanyahu has something to gain from maintaining a good relationship with Trump because Trump has appointed a lot of very strong supporters of Israel to key positions, including the ambassador to Israel. There are many in his camp that fully believe, for kind of religious and dogmatic reasons, that the US should entirely support Israel and that there's no occupation and things like this. But at the same time, it seems that his envoy has had very tough words with Netanyahu and said, we're not going to put up with it, this has to go through, and we're not going to have the policy set by the far-right members of the coalition. So in a way, I think it's about projecting power, it's about talking tough, and the Trump camp will feel validated in their approach that, to them, in a world of neo-populists, a neo-populist is the person that knows how to work with Netanyahu or Putin or Xi or Orban or any of the others. And there might be truth in that. But that style doesn't lend itself necessarily to the sustained and dogged approach and to dealing with the many details and hiccups along the way that tend to bedevil these processes. As for the Biden administration, I mean, there have been a striking number of diplomats that have resigned over Gaza policy, and many of them say that the president himself, he has a very strong admiration for Israel. He really doesn't want to see it in any negative light, almost regardless of what it has done. So there have been a number of times where the US has set down certain red lines, for instance, on humanitarian aid, but if they're crossed, nothing happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely fascinating, this dynamic, because everybody assumed Trump is going to be a completely unfettered supporter of Israel. His son-in-law is Jewish. He has close friends in the American-Israeli community. So everyone assumed he was just going to give Netanyahu carte blanche, but actually this has been turned on its head. And when he said a few days ago there'll be hell to pay if the hostages aren't released, and everyone thought this was sort of a strong message to Hamas that, the gloves are off and Israel can do what it likes in Gaza. But actually, the real pressure that Trump was applying was on Netanyahu. And then Biden, who has tried to adopt this measured approach of behind-the-scenes persuasion, and it's completely failed. So it is vindication for Donald Trump, I think. And I think it's an interesting herald of what we might see in Trump too, that actually he's willing to twist the arms of friends and foes alike. But there's also Hamas. I mean, Antony Blinken was giving an interview recently where he said every time we got close to a deal, Hamas would back away. I mean, he was putting the blame on Hamas that every time it looked like Israel was coming to the negotiating table, Hamas would interpret that as because international pressure on Israel, criticism of its behavior, isolation, made Hamas think, oh, well, maybe we can just wait this out and there'll be a little bit more pressure on Israel. So Blinken was putting a lot of the blame primarily on Hamas. So Trump may have helped deliver Netanyahu, but what was it that helped deliver Hamas?
Trump has had an effect here as well. not least on Qatar, which is one of the key interlocutors here, that I think for Qatar, they will have been keen to say to Hamas, look, we have to get this across the line before Trump comes in. There's a big risk that if this is dragging on, he will turn around and say to us, why are you talking to terrorists? Finish the job of kicking them out that you said you'd do last year. I'm not having this. And Hamas will also have been reading the runes and have been thinking maybe the entry of Donald Trump will make Israel's position stronger. So now is the time. That said, it is more difficult to parse the inner workings of Hamas. Within Israel, there is the very active media and civil society and pretty much a lot of disaffected people in the military and intelligence who chat to journalist friends in their very small society. So it's easier to get more information. And I think, Blinken will have had his own reasons for the versions of events that he puts forward. He obviously is an insider who knows almost everything. But there's also at the moment a period of lengthy self-justification from the Biden administration.
You don't say. I've been hearing it non-stop in the press conferences given by President Biden. I mean, this is a slightly bitter pill for Biden, who's trying to claim credit for the deal. And his team definitely deserve credit for the detailed legwork, the sort of painstaking months and months and months of negotiation. But at the end of the day, it's a little bit like the Carter-Reagan Iran hostage scenario where the Iranians waited until it was Reagan swearing in before they released the hostages. And it's not an entirely dissimilar scenario now. However, let's get on to a slightly harder topic. What are the prospects for even these first phases going smoothly, let alone the longer-term elements? I mean, already in the 24 hours since the deal was negotiated, we've seen a lot of the hostage families celebrate this, but we've also seen relatives of soldiers killed and more conservative elements of Israeli society protesting. You've had Netanyahu saying Hamas is guilty of bad faith, trying to haggle over which prisoners are released on the Israeli side. And then you've got Hamas and Gazans accusing Israel of still bombing them. I mean, is this even going to get over the line, the first few phases? What are your sense of will this last?
I've had the opportunity to attend, I think, 3 meetings where Palestinians and Israelis from outside government have come together and discussed the conflict since October 7th began, each one of them being outside in venues in Europe. And trauma is the word that recurs even among the seasoned peace activists. Even among them, it's difficult to talk now and to see the way forward because each society is traumatized and they cannot empathize with the other ones. Beyond a few absolutely incredible people, and there really are amazing peace activists in both sides who are trying to make a difference against all these odds. At the same time, there's a big conflict fatigue, and the Israeli government may lose some members over getting this through, but they have had the leader of the opposition say, we'll vote with the government, we'll do what we can to get this through. At the end of the day, the politicians believe there is a constituency for it. But what's next? Because, ceasefires should be the first step in a process, but most ceasefires also collapse. And if it is the case that this is getting through because essentially Team Trump want a victory ahead of the inauguration that looks nice on TV, how does that play into sustaining a deal and getting to this next phase of who's going to be in charge in Gaza? Is there an acceptance of Hamas or some members of Hamas being part of some kind of government? Or is that impossible for Israel and the US to support? How does it link up with the idea of actually finding a political solution when most of the world is in favour of a two-state solution, but Team Trump are not very interested in that? So there are huge risks. But this is an opportunity. I think we can say a ceasefire presents an opportunity, sometimes a short-lived one, to get things working.
But look, we're going to come back to those longer term issues. I'm talking about just this phase 1, let alone phase 2. I mean, it seems to me that this is a deal that has been reached somewhat through gritted teeth. Both sides have sort of been ground down. They're not going to get any further with this conflict, and more deaths, more hostages will die, more Palestinians will die. It also seems to me that Netanyahu, there's currently a moment for him. I mean, right now, there's about to be a US president that is more focused and more supportive on taking the challenge to Iran, which is Israel's long-term strategic threat. Hezbollah has been effectively, they're not eliminated, but sidelined for the moment in Lebanon. Syria, with the fall of the Assad regime, there's sort of new openings there. The architect of the October the 7th attack has been killed, as you said, in Gaza. So Netanyahu, at the moment, he can come away with some kind of enhanced standing. And where a year ago everyone thought Netanyahu's popularity was cratering and he had to keep the war going simply as a way to stay in office, I mean, actually, more than a year on, his popularity has recovered. He's quite strong. He's broadened his coalition, and he's got the space to sideline some of the more hardline members of his coalition. And then from Hamas's point of view, yeah, they face the threat of a US presidency that has no sympathy or time for them whatsoever and could let the gloves off Israel completely, and certainly is not going to restrict arms sales to Israel. And, you know, Hamas, all they've achieved is they've seen their allies in Lebanon, Syria destroyed. They've seen Iran weakened. They're alone. They're isolated. But at least they're still alive. I mean, this gives them some kind of breathing space to see if they've got any potential future. But I've also been reading that a lot of Palestinians are absolutely fed up with Hamas. They may not have the confidence to say it out loud yet, but I've seen quite a lot of opinion polling saying that the majority of Palestinians, I mean, they don't like the Palestinian Authority. They have very little time for the Palestinian Authority, but they do blame Hamas. They don't want Hamas to be back in charge of Gaza. So then we get to who is going to be released on both sides. I mean, I simply can't imagine the trauma for the hostages. I mean, my heart absolutely bleeds for the hostages' families and this dreadful period where families wait to see if their family members are one of the ones who are alive and in what condition they are after 15 months of captivity. And then the heartbreaking news for those who may discover or have their worst fears confirmed that their family members are dead. So that is going to be a period of huge trauma. So do you think, I mean, I sort of feel reasonably hopeful we'll make it through the first 33. But for Hamas to trust Israel well enough to release the remaining hostages, which are their only guarantee against Israel restarting the war, that's quite a big ask, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, this question of who provides guarantees is a massive issue for any ceasefire and negotiation, which at the end of the day are usually between sides that hate one another. So there isn't the trust. So you need somebody to guarantee and implement. But the US has never been neutral mediator in this conflict, and yet it is, at the end of the day, the only serious player. I mean, talking about the international order, as we so often do, Russia and China have been essentially absent from this. The European Union has been chronically divided on the issue. So we've just seen again and again the dependency on the US to see things through. And if there are violations of the ceasefire by Hamas or violations of the ceasefire by Israel, what are the reactions going to be of Team Trump? And how will they sustain this process? All that said, if we think about, what you've just described in terms of the positions of both sides, we can see that both Netanyahu and the Hamas leadership can construct a narrative where they talk to their base and they say, we've won. And that's quite useful, actually. That is where you have to start. And that's, the Hamas one will be, we're still standing, we've survived, we cannot be destroyed. And yes, I think that will ring hollow for most Palestinians. I mean, Hamas has ruled Gaza by exercising power in an authoritarian manner, and most Palestinians aren't particularly keen on what it offers in terms of morality and, the political Islam. Most Palestinians are pretty secular, but there's not much option for the Palestinians to change their leadership.
Right. So the very fact that either party can try and create this narrative that they won is just such a graphic illustration of the kind of warped mindset and the zero-sum perspective that prevails in that region, when from everybody else's perspective in the outside world, nobody's won, everyone's a loser in this conflict. But that's a good moment to take a break, because after the break, I think we need to come back and discuss what are the prospects for turning this ceasefire into a real, lasting, sustainable peace. Has anything really fundamental changed as a result of this conflict? Welcome back. In the first part of this episode, we talked about the actual specifics of the deal, who the main players were, what made it happen now, and what are the prospects for delivering and achieving even phases 1 and 2, the exchange of hostages and prisoners and Israeli pullback and humanitarian aid. But as you alluded in your opening remarks, the really knotty question is what happens next? I mean, is this sustainable in the longer term? The much harder questions. Who governs Gaza long term? Who guarantees this peace? What happens to the Palestinian Authority? Is there really any shift in the fundamental mindset of the players in this Greek tragedy? So, Jane, help us through this. Has anything really changed on the fundamentals?
The events of the past 15 months, I think, have made it harder for Palestinians and Israelis to believe in a future that involves some kind of peaceful coexistence. But at the same time, it has shown the rest of the world that this isn't a frozen conflict that would just go away. And this is a lesson we seem to keep failing to learn. Ukraine and its war with Russia was seen as a frozen conflict. Syria was seen as a frozen conflict. Geopolitical trends are heating all of these conflicts up, so they need to be fixed. And usually it's better if they're fixed much earlier, but sometimes there are opportunities after periods of extreme violence when people are really fatigued with war, when they don't see scope for violence to bring about more, if they can come to believe that people on the other side would also forswear violence and be able to live alongside them. So to me, you need to be bringing in expertise now from people that have lived through the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, people that have lived through Rwanda, people that have lived through Sudan or are still living through Sudan, people that have been in divided societies that have undergone mass atrocities and that can say, I believe that peace was never, ever, ever possible and something changed. So I think there is something there about belief. Now, I also think the leaders in conflicts tend to have more cynical motivations from that. I don't see much changing unless there are changes in leadership. And everyone has kind of always said this about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Bad leaders are part of the problem. But the leaders are partly there because they have constituencies. They also have, international support. And I think the fact that this conflict has somehow become entangled with a war over the international order can make it harder to resolve. I think it's been very useful for countries that want to challenge US dominance, notably Russia, to sort of deflect criticism over its war in Ukraine by saying, well, what about Gaza? And that's all very effective.
I mean, you talked about leadership. It seems to me that Israel has thrown up a succession of different leaders who have shown the capacity to make peace deals. Netanyahu may not be the guy, probably isn't the guy, but there are other figures in Israel, and it is a democracy. They can throw up the leaders to make peace deals, even though the climate there right now is probably more hostile to some kind of Palestinian statehood than it's ever been as a result of what's happened. The real issue seems to me the problem on the Palestinian side. Can they produce the leader? And the one individual who I have heard talk of over the decades as a potentially different kind of Palestinian leader is someone called Marwan Barghouti, who is in prison and blamed by Israel for the first and second intifadas, but regarded by many Palestinians as actually a leader with moral authority and with not the same kind of terrorist mindset as Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And one of the things I understand is that Hamas has been trying to get Marwan Barghouti released as part of this deal, and that is something that Israel is not prepared to yield. And that one of Netanyahu's tactics, for which I think he deserves criticism, is that he has preferred to keep the Palestinians weak and divided than actually allow an effective, competent Palestinian leadership to emerge. So what is the solution on the Palestinian side? Where does a Palestinian leader emerge from? I mean, clearly the international community can't accept someone coming from Hamas. I assume, and certainly Israel can't. The Palestinian Authority and the current leader, Mahmoud Abbas, is completely absent and irrelevant. So where does this Palestinian leadership come from?
Lots of ideas here. So it's kind of funny to me that just over 20 years ago, the first piece of research that I did on the Middle East for a peace organisation on behalf of a government was looking at emerging Palestinian leaders, both political leaders and civil society leaders, because at that time Yasser Arafat was seen by many in the West as the sticking point. And of course, the issues have gone well beyond him. But Marwan Barghouti at that time was seen as one of the major possibilities. And he's been in jail, throughout that period.
And probably has changed as a result of his time in jail.
And people wonder also how much do the youth know him, support him. I mean, there has been polling that suggests that he still has a constituency. And he's been active over the years in political statements, declarations on behalf of the prisoners. I think part of what makes him appealing is the fact that he has been in prison for so long, that something that would be important for a very credible, legitimate future Palestinian leader is that they have been suffering, that they're not seen as people that are more focused on enriching themselves and
sort of
doing
sellouts.
deals, getting their cousins' business interests, and then essentially just going along with the occupation because they're sellouts, exactly. Or, the PLO leadership for a long time was exiled in Tunisia, and that created a lot of divisions between those that had remained on the ground. Sadly, obviously, like most Palestinians have been suffering so much that there's no shortage of people to choose from. It goes way beyond the one person as well. I have asked Palestinian friends and contacts over the past year, sort of, why doesn't Mahmoud Abbas resign at this point? And some people will say, because if he goes, there's also a huge bun fight to be had within Fatah among the ranks about who succeeds him, and not many of them are very popular or liked. So you always have this question, like, how much is it the individuals, how much is it the structure? Some of it is structural, I think, with the Palestinian Authority, because the West and the international community have wanted a Palestinian Authority that will essentially ensure Israel's security. But they have prioritised that against everything else, including having a government that Palestinians really believe in. And then the criticism comes, well, why can't these guys take a peace deal forward? They can't because they don't have the legitimacy, so they just fall back on rhetoric. But I mean, young Palestinians have loads of ideas about Palestinian reform. You could look at having, some transitional government in Gaza that is bringing in also technocrats, bringing in people, for example, that have been running hospitals. Some of those are the heroes, the people from civil defence making do with, half the fire engines that they used to have while everything is burning. These might be some of the people that have credibility, but it's a huge, huge issue that seems to recur for the Palestinians.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. I asked my friend Nabil who he thought would govern Gaza afterwards. And I said, I presume not Hamas. And he said, absolutely not. He could see a technical council of technocrats. He said local officials with administrative capabilities, but not political. And I see some merit in that, as you said. I mean, there are heroes who've emerged from this conflict, the doctors, the civil defense. And you could just focus on rebuilding Gaza and slightly park the longer term issues. I mean, perhaps it's a mistake and extremely naive even to be beginning to talk about, well, what's the longer term Palestinian issues is stated on the table, because it's a nonsense right now. Clearly, there's just not the right context for that. And what is needed is a period of grieving, rebuilding, and just stabilization. It's not peace, but it's not war.
The problem is, I think in the situation the Palestinians are in, you cannot get the economy to work without political and security progress. I think these issues have been tested multiple times, including by Tony Blair when he was the Middle East peace envoy, and efforts that were made by the World Bank and others. Because there was such a long period where the political track was stalled, many thought maybe the economy can be the way to unblock this. And that thinking infused the first Trump administration as well, also kind of through the lens of like everything's basically a real estate deal. The deal of the century that Trump laid out was very much around forget statehood, but quality of life matters, and Gulf countries will put some money in and like life can be better. But that doesn't work if you have no control over your borders and your borders are controlled by your adversary. So there's this situation of dependency on which you cannot build an economy unless you've got enough of an understanding with the people who do control your borders that the economy matters for both. There's also been a lot of work on the IT sector in Gaza and the West Bank, specifically because people hope maybe this is something you could do without being able to get goods to cross the borders.
So is there a way to change the dynamics by widening the lens when the two parties most focused, for them, their political calculations are very narrow if it's just between them? But is there a way to broaden this as part of the grand bargain? Some updated version of the deal of the century, in inverted commas, which you might explain to our listeners as well, because I know you were in Gaza at the time that deal of the century was announced in 2020, but it sort of kind of envisaged this grander bargain whereby Arab states, especially Saudi Arabia, would finally take the step of normalizing relations with Israel in return for meaningful progress on Palestinian statehood, which, even as I say it, seems more wishful thinking. But is there some way outside actors, the EU with financial support, the Arab states with financial support and offering Israel something, America providing some kind of security guarantees? Is there some way to enlarge that framework?
Yes, this is exactly the way forward. And over the years, peacemaking efforts have varied. Sometimes people have tried to look at a big picture. Sometimes they've tried to take a smaller win where it exists. Jimmy Carter wanted a comprehensive approach. He ended up with an Israel-Egypt peace deal, all of this. But since 2002, the Arab League countries have promised that they would all recognise Israel and normalise relations on the basis of a two-state solution. This is a a huge change from the 20th century. This is really a big possibility. But one of the shortcomings of that Arab Peace Initiative was that Iran was not a party to that. And to be honest, when it was announced back in the early 2000s, Israel didn't take it very seriously. And Israel didn't take Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states as seriously as it does today. With the first Trump administration, they did have this idea of the deal of the century and giving Palestinians a better quality of life in return for kind of massive land swaps. But basically, the deal was so similar to Israeli talking points and came from an administration that said the West Bank isn't occupied, Jerusalem is only Israeli, etc., that when it was announced, the Palestinians said, we're not even talking to you anymore. And I'll talk slightly afterwards, if I may, about being on the ground during that time and how divorced American conversations seem to be from Palestinian conversations.
No, tell us.
So, it was really fascinating for me at the time that Trump plan was announced, because I was working at the time for the Elders, and we had gone as the staff of the Elders Secretariat with the Carter Center, which has offices on the ground, to meet with human rights activists from both Israel and Palestine to better understand the situation that they were facing. And we spent one day in Gaza, where it was so striking to me that we met all these brilliant young people. We'd taken a decision not to meet any officials, so it was one of the best trips I've ever made to Israel and Palestine, because, you spoke to all these genuine people that were authentic and had real commitment to making things better.
You weren't engaging with the Palestinian equivalent of the blob. Perhaps you and Trump have more in common than you think.
Well, I've done that on other visits, and I think it's a very different experience. There's a lot of listening to history. So this was a breath of fresh air, meeting all these brilliant people. And, we went into Gaza, which was a huge palaver to get into because you have 3 lots of border controls. We went through the Erez crossing, which had taken a long time to get permits to do. We went through Palestinian Authority passport control and then through Hamas passport control. And I remember saying to one of our Palestinian companions, you guys are very lucky you have so many governments, and he was saying, yes, look how secure we are. You go through this sort of stupid amount of security. But we talked to people about the political situation, and it was just so obvious that for most people, just like they had these 3 border processes, they had 3 layers of oppression. They had oppression from Israel, oppression from the Palestinian Authority, and oppression from Hamas. And the idea that it was an either-or, that, well, they don't like Israel, so they must support Hamas, or they don't like Hamas, so they're pro-Israel. This is nonsense. There's no basis in reality. And we could see how hungry people were for international contact, international support. Can people train journalists? Can people help us to navigate policy debates? What are they saying in your country? What are they saying on the BBC? How can we plug in? And we went, in fact, back the same night to Jerusalem and watched the Trump press conference on the deal of the century, where, there were no Palestinians, but the audience was essentially all Americans and very heavily appealing to the Christian right. And it just struck me as it's really parochial, it's inward-looking. It was a big piece of PR because if you want to play the part of the American president, one of the things you must do is bring peace to the Middle East. And that means a handshake at the White House. It doesn't mean being in the Middle East or talking to any normal people from the Middle East or fixing anything. But it's part of the kind of stagecraft of what is a president supposed to be like, and hopefully then you get the Nobel Peace Prize. But the deal of the century basically didn't work because the Palestinians wouldn't play ball. So they moved on to the Abraham Accords, which is a complicated thing, but I do think part of it for the US was, again, just the desire to get a handshake, make something work. Palestinians won't play ball, so let's get some other people, essentially, to make a peace agreement, even though they weren't at war. And there was then, for quite a long time, this focus, both by Trump and by Biden, on making peace between Israel and the Gulf with the Palestinians not involved. I think now people realise that doesn't work. But if you could bring the two things together, the fact that Israel does have these pretty warm relations with the UAE and kind of mutual respect and interest with Saudi Arabia, that creates some really important incentives and leverage, which the Saudis in particular are trying to use. So I think this, despite my long detour into my own experience of being in Gaza that I've thought about so many times over the last 15 months, this regional track is the way forward. And the principle should be recognition of all for all.
A grand bargain. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. All for all. I have to say, listening to your tales of travelling in and out of Gaza, I first visited Gaza in the 1980s when I was doing my university dissertation on Israeli Arabs and the rise of Hamas. And it was easy. We just drove from Ramallah into Gaza. No checkpoints, no stopping. Just went in. I stayed with Nabil's family in Gaza Beach Camp, which is not actually as nice as it might sound. It's on the beach, but it's a refugee camp. And I was there when President Clinton addressed the Palestinian Authority during his presidency and persuaded them to recognize the state of Israel in their constitution. And I have to say, one element there was Clinton was able to convey empathy for Palestinians. So you were alluding to the fact that in the Trump 1 presidency, there was a certain element of like stagecraft. This is what presidents do. We arrange handshakes. But it was geared for kind of a domestic audience that cared about Israel, and the Palestinian concerns weren't really part of the room. It was over their heads. And what I really admired about President Clinton was that he really engaged with the Palestinians, and he expressed in the way that he has. He was able to convey real empathy and understanding for the circumstances that they were in. And that was both a political gift that he had, but it also meant, as I was looking around the room, because I was in the room when he was giving that address, that you saw Palestinians nodding their heads. And during his visit, every street in Gaza was bedecked with the American flag. I mean, he was hailed as someone who really understood their situation. So I guess sort of the end point here is, Trump, I don't think, he's not an empathetic person. And will his administration bank the achievement of this deal that sort of creates a nice glow over his inauguration? But will they be able to follow through in a way that truly engages the Palestinians? So I think that is a sort of worrying question hanging over this. But the grand bargain is the only way to proceed. I think just sort of the last question is, are there any lessons here for other conflicts? I mean, we know Trump has come in saying he will sort out Ukraine, and he threatens a similar kind of arm-twisting approach, like Ukraine, if you don't come to the table, there's no more arms. Russia, if you don't come to the table, there's a lot more arms for Ukraine. So what does it say about this kind of strongman diplomacy that Trump brings versus the kind of UN special envoy, the sort of endless negotiations and traditional forms of conflict resolution? And can this be applied elsewhere successfully, do you think?
I think there's a time and a place for bringing in the big guy to knock the other big guys' heads together. You see it quite a lot in African conflict resolution as well, where former and current heads of state often make these quite decisive visits and interventions. But it gets something across the line at a critical moment. It's not an ongoing implementation mechanism. It's not a piece of research. It's not a inclusive consultation, but there just are different tools needed for different times. Actually, if we could have all of the US presidents working together, Clinton comes and listens, Biden does some research, Trump knocks the heads together, maybe we get somewhere. I'm reminded of, doing some great, I did a great convening once with women mediators from across the Middle East, with, among other people, a former UN special envoy. And we were talking about the need to have inclusive peace processes that involve women and youth, not because it's kind of warm and fuzzy.
Politically correct and DEI.
But because to actually make the agreement stick, you need people's mums to be making them go and get a job instead of picking up the gun again. You need them to implement. But I do remember this veteran mediator also saying to the women conflict resolvers, sometimes I have just had to sit down with the guys with the guns because it's them that need to stop fighting. And I'd love to design a big inclusive process with all of you, but this has to happen first. So there's a role for all of it. It needs to be used smartly. And I worry that there might be a slight risk of the Trump team thinking, well, this conflict resolution stuff's easy. Next up, Putin. Where, there's much less clarity about what could start the process of unwinding Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Whereas, at least with what's just happened in Gaza, the end game is very distant, but the steps that are needed in the next few weeks have been discussed endlessly, and it's now been about pushing the political will.
All right. Well, Jane, I have absolutely loved doing this episode with you. So, Jason, if you're listening, please let Jane and me have another round at this. This has been absolutely fantastic. Jane, it's been an absolute privilege to have your expertise and to finally get to know you properly. That is definitely enough from us for this week. But please, if you want to help order the disorder, tap follow and maybe you'll find another Jane and Alex episode crop up on your timeline, but you'll certainly be notified when every episode launches.
Yep, and we are on social media too. Just search the Disorder Show and you'll see that we'll be more and more active now on Blue Sky.
And finally, you can read more about today's topic by visiting our show notes.
Our producer is George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern.
Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you have an orderly week.